Bactria, 329 BC. A man is dragged through the sun-baked streets of a conquered city. His hands are lashed tightly behind him, his face swollen and caked with dried blood, after days of relentless torture. The crowd presses in, eager to witness what comes next. This is Bessus, once the satrap of Bactria, a ruler over vast lands of the Persian Empire, and a man bold enough to declare himself the rightful heir of Darius III, after murdering him in cold blood. Now, by the direct command of Alexander the Great, Bessus faces one of the most horrifying deaths known to the ancient world, Impalement, a slow, excruciating execution that could stretch on for days, turning the condemned into a living symbol of terror and retribution. But how did a man who once commanded provinces, armies, and the loyalty of thousands come to this brutal, humiliating end? To understand his fall, we have to turn the clock back to 336 BC, the year Alexander, still only 20, began his legendary campaign against Persia. The young Macedonian king had secured his dominance over Greece and now set his sights on the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. With an army of roughly 35,000 men hardened by years of training and discipline, he marched east, determined to topple the Persian giant and fulfill his father's dream of uniting the known world under Macedonian rule. At this time, Bessus, full name Artaxerxes, Bessus was one of Persia's most influential nobles. As satrap of Bactria, he governed a critical province that stretched across parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. His position was not merely administrative. He wielded both political and military power, commanding elite troops and vast resources. His authority placed him among the empire's highest-ranking aristocrats, living in opulence, surrounded by servants, and presiding over courts filled with wealth and intrigue. Chroniclers described him as tall and imposing, with the dark, full beard of Persian nobility, his eyes sharp and calculating, revealing both intelligence and an ambition that bordered on dangerous. By the time Alexander launched his invasion, Bessus was in his 40s. He had long served under King Darius III, leading Bactrian troops at the monumental Battle of Gaugamela near Arbela, one of the most decisive confrontations in ancient history. The Persian army, though vast, could not match the precision and tactical genius of Alexander's forces. Despite fierce resistance, the Macedonian phalanx shattered the Persian lines, and Alexander's cavalry struck directly at Darius's position. The king barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the east. His once mighty empire, already fracturing from internal strife, began to collapse in the face of relentless conquest. After the crushing defeat at Gaugamela in 331 BC, Darius abandoned his capitals, his treasures, and much of his authority. He fled eastward in a desperate attempt to regroup, pursued every step of the way by Alexander's army. It was during this retreat that cracks began to spread among the Persian leadership. The once great king, now reduced to a fugitive, appeared weak and indecisive, and weakness, in the ancient world, was fatal. For Bessus, the sight of his sovereign in decline was not simply disheartening, it was a moment of revelation. In the shifting balance of power, he saw an opening. By the winter of 331 to 330 BC, Bessus had aligned himself with other disillusioned satraps, including Nabazanes, the court's Chiliarch, and Barzanes, satrap of Arachosia. Their conspiracy was born of fear and ambition in equal measure. They understood that Persia's days were numbered, and that survival under Macedonian rule might depend on a bold gesture. Their plan was ruthless: assassinate Darius, claim his authority, and present themselves as loyal subjects to Alexander in the hope of preserving their status within the new order that was rapidly emerging. The assassination took place in 330 BC, along a desolate road near Hekatompelos. Darius, exhausted after months of flight, was resting in his royal carriage surrounded by a dwindling escort. As his loyal guards slept or wandered in despair, Bessus and his accomplices struck. Ancient accounts suggest that they first urged Darius to surrender to Alexander, promising leniency if he yielded. When the king refused, preferring death to submission, Bessus gave the order. Darius was stabbed multiple times and left to bleed out on the ground. His final moments were spent cursing his betrayers and praying that vengeance would find them. To Bessus, the deed was not murder but necessity. He believed that by removing a failed monarch, he could save the empire, or at the very least himself. He immediately proclaimed himself King of Kings, adopting the royal title Artaxerxes V, and demanded that the remaining Persian troops swear allegiance to him. His first act as the new ruler was macabre, but calculated. He preserved Darius's head in salt and sent it as a gift to Alexander, confident that this gesture of submission would secure his favor. But Bessus had gravely underestimated the man he sought to appease. When the ornate box containing Darius's head was brought into Alexander's tent, the young conqueror's fury was immediate and absolute. To Alexander, Darius had been a worthy adversary, a legitimate ruler who had fought with courage. To see him butchered by his own nobles was an abomination. Far from rewarding Bessus, Alexander had his envoys executed on the spot. He then swore an oath before his men to hunt down the assassin to the ends of the earth. Darius's remains were treated with full royal honors and interred with the dignity befitting a monarch. Alexander personally oversaw the funeral, declaring that the Persian king had fallen not to cowardice, but to treachery. From that moment, Bessus's fate was sealed. He was no longer a satrap, no longer a rival king. He was a fugitive, the most hunted man in the world. Alexander poured enormous resources into the pursuit, redirecting his army's efforts to one goal: vengeance. Bessus fled east into his native Bactria, believing the region's mountainous terrain and fiercely independent tribes would protect him. There, he tried to rally local forces, appealing to their sense of Persian pride and fear of Macedonian domination. For a time it worked. Between 330 and 329 BC, he waged a campaign of resistance, employing hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the invaders. His men struck at night, ambushed small detachments, and disappeared into the wilderness before Alexander could retaliate. But the Macedonian king's determination was unshakable. He built a vast network of spies and informants, offering gold and protection to those who betrayed Bessus's movements. Villages that aided the fugitive were burned. Tribes that refused to cooperate were crushed without mercy. Slowly, the web tightened around Bessus. His allies began to desert him. Isolation replaced command. Fear replaced loyalty. The end came in 329 BC, when Spitamenes, one of Bessus's last remaining allies, and a man of equal cunning, decided to save himself. During a banquet, he had Bessus's wine drugged, then bound him and delivered him to Alexander's men in exchange for amnesty. When Bessus was brought before Alexander, the atmosphere was tense and expectant. The king, now 27 and a seasoned conqueror hardened by years of warfare, stared at his captive in silence. Bessus, stripped of his finery and pride, still tried to justify his actions, claiming that killing Darius had been a political necessity, a way to spare Persia further humiliation. Alexander remained unmoved. His verdict was final and merciless: death by live impalement. The most shameful and agonizing punishment known to man. Live impalement was feared throughout the ancient world. The condemned was forced onto a sharpened stake that entered the body carefully, avoiding vital organs, ensuring that death came slowly, often over several days. The agony was indescribable, the degradation total. The Greeks considered it a barbaric practice. But to Alexander, that was precisely why it was chosen. This would not be a private execution. It would be a statement, a demonstration to all of Asia that betrayal, especially against a king, would be answered with horror beyond imagination. The sentence was to be carried out at dawn on a hill overlooking the Macedonian camp. Alexander ordered the entire army and the local populace to attend. Word spread like wildfire, and by morning, the hill was ringed with thousands, soldiers, camp followers and townspeople, drawn by morbid curiosity and dread. Bessus was brought forth, bound and weakened by days of imprisonment and interrogation. His once commanding presence was gone, his face was drawn, his body trembling, his eyes hollow with the realization that there would be no mercy. Before him stood the stake, long, polished and glinting in the rising sun. Two executioners, veterans of their gruesome trade, awaited the signal. Before the punishment began, Alexander addressed the assembled crowd. His voice carried over the silence, clear and controlled. He recounted the tale of Bessus's treachery, the betrayal of his king, the cowardly murder, the arrogance of declaring himself ruler, and the folly of believing that such deceit could win favor. He reminded them that even in war there existed a code of honor. To meet one's enemy on the battlefield was noble. To strike down one's master in his weakness was an affront to the gods themselves. When the speech ended, the executioners stepped forward. The sentence was about to be fulfilled. Bessus was forced onto the stake. According to the Persian method, the sharpened end was driven slowly into his body in such a way that it avoided the vital organs, ensuring that death would not come swiftly, but only after long, unbearable suffering. The executioners, men who had performed this grim task many times before, worked with methodical precision, coating the stake with oil so it would pierce more cleanly and prolong the agony. Ropes bound Bessus's arms and legs to prevent him from struggling free, forcing his body to remain upright as the stake rose higher through him. His face contorted in agony, but he refused at first to cry out, holding on to the last vestiges of pride that once belonged to a man who had dared to call himself King of Kings. The crowd, a mix of soldiers, locals and camp followers, fell into a tense, horrified silence as the spectacle unfolded. The only sound was the low groaning of the wood and the faint, ragged breaths of the condemned. Then came Bessus's first scream, sharp, raw, and unrestrained, a sound that cut through the morning air and sent a shiver even through the hardened soldiers who had seen countless deaths. Ancient chroniclers would later write that he remained conscious for hours, alternating between desperate cries and moments of eerie silence when his strength seemed to fade only for the pain to revive him again. Alexander stood near the front of the crowd, unmoving. His gaze remained fixed on the man who had once been a symbol of defiance, now reduced to a broken figure writhing under the sun. Those who stood close to the Macedonian king later claimed that his face showed no emotion, neither anger nor satisfaction, only an implacable stillness, as though he were watching not a man, but a lesson being delivered to the world. The heat of the day grew oppressive, and the air shimmered with dust and sweat. Yet Alexander did not turn away. He stayed there until the sun dipped toward the horizon, until Bessus's screams weakened to low moans. By nightfall, the condemned man still clung to life. His body trembled, his head sagged against his chest, but his heart continued to beat. Guards were ordered to keep watch through the night, ensuring no one dared to approach or offer mercy. The firelight flickered across the hill, casting long shadows over the scene, and the smell of blood and sweat hung heavy in the air. When dawn came again, Bessus was barely alive. His skin had turned ashen, his breathing shallow and uneven, yet the stake had done its work. Missing the vital organs, it had preserved him in a state between life and death. Alexander's executioners had mastered the art of prolonging torment. As the second day dragged on, the once proud satrap's strength finally failed. Blood loss, shock, and the creeping infection of his wounds overcame him. His head drooped, his body slackened, and at last, after 2 days of suffering, his breathing stopped. Alexander had his vengeance, yet even in death, Bessus was denied peace. His body was left on the stake for a full week, exposed to the harsh sun and the cold night winds. From miles away, travelers could see the silhouette of his corpse, a grim monument to the conqueror's justice. The carrion birds began to circle overhead, and the people of Bactria spoke in whispers of the man who had once ruled them, now reduced to a warning post on the horizon. It was a message written in flesh that Alexander's reach was absolute and his memory of betrayal eternal. The execution marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign. With Bessus's death, the last organized resistance in Bactria collapsed. The remaining satraps either surrendered or were swiftly subdued. Alexander, having avenged Darius, could now claim total control over the eastern provinces and push deeper into Central Asia without fear of revolt. Yet even as his political goal was achieved, something within him changed. Chroniclers noticed a new hardness in the young conqueror's demeanor. The spectacle of Bessus's execution, its deliberate cruelty, its theatrical precision, revealed a side of Alexander that many had not seen before. He had always been ruthless in war, but now his sense of justice seemed fused with a cold, relentless suspicion. The more power he gained, the less he seemed able to trust those around him. Men who had once shared his victories began to fear his temper, for the slightest hint of disloyalty could bring swift and merciless retribution. The death of Bessus did not end betrayal in Alexander's empire. It only deepened the paranoia that betrayal might lurk anywhere. In the years that followed, as Alexander campaigned against the Scythians, the Sogdians, and later across the Indus, the same streak of pitiless authority resurfaced again and again. Governors were executed for hesitation, officers demoted or killed for questioning orders. Even his closest companions, men like Philotas and later Parmenion, would fall victim to his growing mistrust. The young king, who once inspired loyalty through vision and charisma, now ruled increasingly through fear, a transformation rooted in moments like the death of Bessus. Yet the tale of Bessus did not vanish into the dust of time. It endured in stories whispered along trade routes and told by travelers in marketplaces and caravanserais. Generations retold the legend of the satrap who dared to betray his king and paid the ultimate price. In the lands of Bactria, mothers would warn their sons that ambition without loyalty led only to ruin, and poets would speak of the man who had sought a crown but found only the stake. Historians centuries later would see in his fate a timeless moral, the arrogance of a man who mistook cunning for wisdom, and the danger of underestimating a ruler like Alexander. Bessus had power, rank, and the loyalty of men, yet he lacked the foresight to see that the man he sought to appease valued honor above convenience. For Alexander, the episode became part of his legend, both glorious and grim. He had avenged Darius, upheld the sanctity of kingship, and demonstrated the reach of his authority. But in doing so, he revealed the darker foundation of empire, that beneath every triumph lay fear, and that the same power that commands loyalty can just as easily destroy it. The story of Bessus's end, echoed across centuries, stands not only as the downfall of one man but as a mirror reflecting the brutal truths of conquest and kingship. Modern leaders often remember his lightning campaigns, his bold tactics, and his vision of a world united under his banner, but the execution of Bessus stands as a stark reminder of the other side of that legacy. The unflinching cruelty that accompanied Alexander's conquests, the deliberate terror he wielded to shape obedience, and the willingness to make an example that would sear itself into the collective memory of all who witnessed it. It showed that beneath the brilliance of strategy lay a cold understanding of fear as a political weapon. It is easy, looking back, to see the story as inevitable, the ambitious satrap meeting his match in the unstoppable conqueror. Yet in its time, this was no foregone conclusion. It was a deadly game of survival, played across the vast expanse of empire, the hunted and the hunter, the betrayer and the avenger, both driven by ambition and pride. Each man moved through the shifting sands of loyalty and power, knowing that one misstep could mean death. When the hill where Bessus died finally fell silent, when the stake was taken down and his remains were carried away to be disposed of without ceremony, the silence that followed was not peace but memory. The execution burned itself into the minds of all who saw it, and those who hadn't would hear it told again and again. The story passed from soldier to soldier, from merchant to caravan guard, carried across deserts and mountains. It became a legend not written in stone or carved in royal inscription, but in whispered voices that would outlast both men, echoing long after their empires had crumbled into dust. In the end, the tale of Bessus is not merely about ancient politics or the collision of empires. It is about the razor-thin line that separates power from ruin, about the fatal moment when ambition crosses into overreach, and about the merciless pursuit of vengeance by a man who refused to forgive betrayal, no matter how far he had to go to punish it. It is the portrait of a world where loyalty was currency and treachery was repaid with suffering beyond imagination, and so his story endures, the satrap who reached for the throne and found instead the stake. The man whose death stood as one of the most merciless acts of royal justice in the ancient world, a dark testament to an age when power was upheld not only by courage and vision, but by terror, and when the price of treason was measured in screams that echoed across the desert winds. Bactria, 329 BC. A man is dragged through the sun-baked streets of a conquered city. His wrists are tied so tightly that the ropes bite into his flesh, leaving deep welts across his skin. His face is swollen and caked with layers of blood and dust, his eyes sunken from days of sleepless interrogation. The air is heavy with heat, and the crowd presses in on either side of the street, murmuring, eager, horrified, drawn by the morbid fascination of what is about to unfold. The man stumbles, his knees buckling beneath him, but the soldiers yank him upright again. This is Bessus, once the satrap of Bactria, a man who ruled over one of the richest and most strategic provinces of the Persian Empire. He had been a figure of immense authority, commanding armies and collecting tribute from lands that stretched across the high plains of Central Asia. He had lived surrounded by luxury and ceremony, attended by courtiers and guarded by loyal soldiers. But that power was gone. Now he was a captive, a man condemned to suffer one of the most terrifying deaths known to antiquity, live impalement, a punishment so cruel it was spoken of in whispers even among hardened warriors. By the direct command of Alexander the Great, the execution would be carried out in full view of the army and the local populace, a deliberate display of vengeance and dominion. It would not be quick. The process could stretch on for hours, even days, as the condemned was lifted onto a sharpened stake that would pierce the body without immediately killing. The purpose was not only death but degradation, a slow unmaking of flesh and spirit until both were broken. But how did a man who once commanded provinces, armies, and the loyalty of thousands come to such an end, dragged through the dust to die before his conqueror's eyes? To understand the tragedy and arrogance of his fall, we must turn back to 336 BC, the year Alexander, still only 20 years old, began his monumental campaign against Persia. The young Macedonian king, fresh from securing his hold over Greece, had already shown flashes of brilliance that would make his name immortal. Now he turned his ambition eastward toward the Persian Empire, a vast realm stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, with an army of roughly 35,000 men, disciplined, battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. He set out to topple the greatest power the world had ever known. At that time, Bessus, whose full name was Artaxerxes Bessus, was one of the empire's most powerful nobles. As satrap of Bactria, he governed a province of enormous wealth and strategic importance, encompassing territories that now lie within modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. His rule extended over mountain fortresses, fertile valleys and trade routes that funneled riches from east to west. He was a man accustomed to command, surrounded by soldiers, courtiers and servants who addressed him as lord. Chroniclers described him as tall and broad-shouldered, with the dark flowing beard that marked the Persian elite, and eyes said to gleam with both intelligence and unbridled ambition. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia, Bessus was already a seasoned warrior in his 40s, respected for his tactical skill and feared for his cunning. He had long served under King Darius III, leading Bactrian troops in the monumental clash at Gaugamela near Arbela, one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. But even the courage of Persia's finest could not withstand Alexander's mastery of the battlefield. Darius's armies crumbled before the disciplined ranks of Macedonian phalanxes and the lightning strikes of their cavalry. The defeat at Gaugamela in 331 BC shattered Persian confidence. Darius, once the ruler of the largest empire on earth, abandoned his capitals, Babylon, Susa and Persepolis, and fled eastward, carrying what treasures he could. His authority waned with every step of retreat, and his courtiers began to whisper, "A king on the run was no king at all." In an empire built on divine kingship, weakness was not tolerated. Bessus watched the unraveling of Darius's power with growing frustration. To him, the king's retreat was not prudence but disgrace. Each day of flight eroded the respect of generals and governors alike. In the shadows of that decline, Bessus saw opportunity. By the winter of 330 BC, he began to conspire with other high-ranking satraps, including Nabazanes, the powerful Chiliarch of the royal guard, and Bazanes, satrap of Arachosia. Together they hatched a plan that combined treachery and calculation in equal measure to seize Darius, kill him, and present his body to Alexander as proof of their allegiance to the new order rising from the west. The assassination took place in 330 BC, somewhere along the dusty road near Ecbatana. Darius, weary from his endless flight, was resting in his carriage, his retinue reduced and demoralized. It was there that Bessus and his co-conspirators struck. Some accounts claim they tried to persuade Darius to surrender to Alexander, hoping for clemency. When he refused, proud even in defeat, Bessus gave the signal, the blades flashed, and the great king was stabbed and left to die in his own chariot. His last breaths were spent cursing the traitors who had once sworn their loyalty to him. For Bessus, this was the moment he had awaited. With Darius dead, he proclaimed himself King of Kings, adopting the royal title Artaxerxes V. He demanded allegiance from what remained of the Persian forces and began issuing decrees as the rightful successor to the Achaemenid throne. To win Alexander's favor, he had Darius's head preserved in salt and sent to the Macedonian camp as an offering, a grotesque symbol of loyalty. But Bessus had catastrophically misjudged the man he sought to appease. When the ornate box containing Darius's severed head reached Alexander, the conqueror's reaction was not gratitude but outrage. To Alexander, Darius had been more than an enemy. He had been a worthy adversary, a king who had faced him honorably in battle. The act of betrayal by Darius's own satraps was in Alexander's eyes a crime beyond forgiveness. He ordered the immediate execution of the envoys who brought the grisly trophy and swore an oath before his army that he would pursue Bessus to the ends of the earth. Darius's body, found not long after, was treated with solemn reverence. Alexander arranged for it to be wrapped in royal cloth, buried according to Persian custom, and mourned as one king honors another. It was a gesture of both respect and power, the conqueror declaring himself not merely Darius's destroyer but his avenger and heir. From that moment, Bessus became the most wanted man in the known world. His plan to secure survival had collapsed into disaster. He was no longer a noble seeking favor, but a hunted criminal.
Alexander diverted his campaign to pursue him personally, sending scouts ahead, bribing local tribes, and dispatching envoys with promises of reward for anyone who betrayed the fugitive satrap. Bessus fled east into his native Bactria, confident that its remote valleys and mountain fortresses would protect him. He believed that the loyalty of his people and the unforgiving terrain would keep the Macedonians at bay. Gathering what remained of his troops, he called on the fierce Bactrian and Sogdian tribes to resist the invaders. For a time, it seemed he might succeed. His forces harried Alexander's supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and vanished into the wilderness before pursuit could catch them. The struggle became a war of shadows, a test of endurance between a desperate fugitive and a relentless conqueror, one whose wrath had become personal and whose vengeance would stop only when the last breath left Bessus's body.
For a time it worked. Between 330 and 329 BC, Bessus waged a relentless guerrilla war against the Macedonian invaders. His troops, though fewer in number and poorly equipped compared to Alexander's disciplined legions, knew the terrain intimately. They struck swiftly from the shadows, ambushing isolated Macedonian patrols, cutting off supply lines, and vanishing into the rugged valleys and high mountain passes before Alexander's main force could retaliate. These tactics frustrated the conqueror and gave Bessus the illusion that he could hold out indefinitely, shielded by the unforgiving geography of Bactria and the loyalty of its fierce tribesmen. But Alexander's persistence was unshakable. He was not a man to be deterred by distance, terrain, or resistance. He began constructing a vast network of spies and informants that reached deep into the satrapies of Central Asia. Gold was his weapon now, as much as the sword, and he offered generous rewards for any information leading to Bessus's capture. Villages suspected of harboring the fugitive were burned to the ground, their leaders executed, and their people enslaved as a warning to others. Slowly, the net began to tighten. One by one, Bessus's allies fell away, driven either by fear or self-interest. Isolation crept upon him like a shadow, and for the first time, the man who had once commanded armies began to feel truly hunted. The final betrayal came in 329 BC. Spitamenes, once Bessus's most trusted ally and a skilled commander in his own right, decided that the winds of fortune had turned. During a banquet held in the dim light of a Bactrian fortress, Spitamenes served his lord a cup of wine laced with a powerful sedative. As Bessus slipped into unconsciousness, he was bound in chains and handed over to Macedonian scouts. In exchange for this act of treachery, Spitamenes secured his own pardon from Alexander, though fate would later deal him a similar end. When Bessus was dragged before Alexander's camp, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. The soldiers whispered among themselves, many of them eager to see the man responsible for the death of Darius III. Alexander, now 27 and hardened by years of unbroken conquest, regarded his prisoner with a cold, unwavering gaze. Bessus, filthy and beaten, but still clinging to the remnants of his pride, dared to justify his crime. He claimed that Darius's death had been an act of political necessity, a desperate measure to prevent further humiliation for Persia and to ensure the empire's survival under new leadership. Alexander listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the air like a blade. He declared that Bessus would die by live Impalement, the most agonizing and shameful punishment known to the ancient world. The sentence was designed not merely to kill, but to destroy utterly, body and spirit alike, serving as a warning to all who might ever contemplate treachery against their king. Live Impalement was infamous across the ancient world. The condemned was pierced by a sharpened wooden stake, often inserted in such a way as to avoid vital organs, ensuring a prolonged, horrifying death that could stretch over several days. While Persians had long practiced it as a symbol of divine justice, the Greeks considered it a mark of barbarism. Alexander's decision to use it, therefore, was deliberate. He wanted to make an example of Bessus, a demonstration of vengeance that would echo through history. The execution was set for the following morning on a high hill overlooking the Macedonian encampment. Word of it spread quickly, and by dawn, the hill was surrounded by soldiers, camp followers, and villagers who had come from miles away to witness the fate of the traitor. The rising sun bathed the scene in a harsh golden light as the executioners prepared the instruments of death. Bessus was brought forth, his wrists bound tightly behind him, his body frail from imprisonment and torture. The regal bearing that had once defined the satrap of Bactria was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. Before the execution began, Alexander addressed the assembled crowd. His voice was calm but filled with authority as he recounted Bessus's crimes, the betrayal of Darius, the desecration of royal loyalty, and the arrogance of proclaiming himself king. He reminded all present that even in war there was honor, that foes might fight and fall with dignity, but treachery from within was a stain that no victory could cleanse. When the speech ended, the executioners stepped forward. The stake, a long and polished beam of wood, stood ready, its tip sharpened to a cruel point. The men forced Bessus down, stripping away what little dignity he had left. Then, with practiced precision, they impaled him according to the Persian method, entering the body at an angle designed to avoid the heart and lungs, ensuring the agony would last. Ropes were tied around his limbs to prevent him from thrashing or escaping the stake's slow, relentless penetration. The crowd fell into an uneasy silence broken only by the first scream, a raw, piercing sound that tore through the still air. Witnesses later recalled how Bessus's cries shifted from rage to pleading, then to an eerie, hollow moan as his strength began to fade. He lingered for hours, sometimes convulsing violently, sometimes lapsing into stillness, his face pale and drenched with sweat. Alexander watched the entire ordeal without turning away. He stood near the front of the gathering, his expression cold and impassive. Some of his officers shifted uncomfortably, but none dared speak. By nightfall, Bessus still clung to life, slipping in and out of consciousness. Guards were ordered to stand watch through the night, ensuring that no one dared interfere or end his suffering prematurely. When dawn broke, the condemned man was still breathing. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his skin ghostly white, his body trembling from shock. The executioners had done their work with dreadful skill. The stake had missed vital organs while inflicting maximum torment. As the second day dragged on, his breathing grew weaker. By evening, blood loss, exhaustion, and infection had taken their toll. His head fell forward, and the hilltop fell silent. Bessus was dead. Alexander had his vengeance. But the punishment did not end with death. Bessus's body was left impaled for an entire week, his corpse exposed to the unrelenting sun and the scavenging winds of the steppe. From miles away, travelers could see the grim silhouette of his body hanging limp upon the stake, a macabre monument to the fate of traitors. The sight was impossible to ignore, a warning carved not in stone, but in flesh. It reminded all who passed that Alexander's justice was absolute, his reach long, and his memory unforgiving. Even the silence of the desert seemed to echo the message. Treachery would not only be punished, it would be made eternal through fear. The execution marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign. With Bessus's death, the last organized resistance in the eastern provinces of the Persian Empire collapsed. Bactria, long a refuge for rebels and exiled nobles, now lay under complete Macedonian control. Alexander's armies could march deeper into Central Asia unchallenged, their supply lines secure, and their dominance undisputed. Yet victory brought with it a new kind of darkness. Chroniclers from the period observed a change in the young conqueror's demeanor, subtle at first but unmistakable. The calculated cruelty of Bessus's execution, the deliberate choice to watch every moment of his agony, and the public display of his corpse revealed something shifting within Alexander's mind, a growing willingness to employ fear as a tool of rule. From that moment onward, suspicion seemed to settle over him like a shadow. Alexander had once prided himself on rewarding loyalty and respecting even defeated enemies. But after Bessus, the boundaries between justice and vengeance began to blur. He grew less trusting of those around him, his eyes sharper, his temper quicker to ignite. Generals and governors who once dined with him as equals now measured their words carefully, aware that a hint of disloyalty could mean ruin. The same man who had inspired armies to march across continents with boundless devotion now began to rule through the more tangible currency of fear. Ironically, Bessus's death did not rid Alexander's empire of treachery. Within just a few years, whispers of conspiracy began to surface again. Plots among generals, uprisings among satraps, and betrayals within his own ranks. Some of these conspirators paid with their lives, executed in the dead of night or before assembled troops. Others were stripped of rank, their names erased from official records. Alexander was learning a lesson older than any empire. Fear might ensure obedience, but never true loyalty. It could keep men silent, but not faithful. Still, the tale of Bessus endured, retold across the empire as both warning and legend. It was spoken of in dimly lit taverns along caravan routes, in the bustling markets of Susa and Persepolis, and among soldiers around distant campfires. To some it was a story of poetic justice, the rightful punishment of a man who had betrayed his king. To others it was a grim parable of power's cruelty, proof that those who reached too high would always be struck down. The people of Bactria in particular kept the memory alive, passing it down through generations as a cautionary tale. They told of the satrap who had murdered Darius III, declared himself king, and ended his life impaled beneath the eyes of the very conqueror he had tried to outsmart. Bessus's death was more than the fall of one man. It marked the symbolic end of Persia's ancient royal line and the dawn of a new, unyielding order. The sight of his body, left to rot under the open sky, sent shockwaves through the conquered territories. It proclaimed more loudly than any decree that the age of the Achaemenid kings had passed, and that the Macedonian ruler now held both power and divine right. To Alexander's followers, this was justice fulfilled, the avenging of a noble king by a new and greater one. But to many Persians it was an act of calculated terror, a cruel assertion that their world had changed forever. In a single act, Alexander had avenged Darius and claimed moral authority over the fallen empire. Yet this victory came at a personal cost that none could fully measure. Those closest to him, generals, companions, and scribes, later remarked that something in their king's heart had hardened after Bessus's execution. His belief in mercy, once a defining part of his character, seemed to fade. His ambition had always burned bright, but now it was tempered by an ever-present distrust. He began to see loyalty as a fragile illusion, something that could break at the slightest strain. This newfound suspicion followed him everywhere, into councils of war, diplomatic meetings, and even moments of private reflection. His later campaigns against the Scythians and Sogdians and into the fierce lands of India bore the mark of this transformation. Alexander's leadership grew harsher, his punishments more severe. Governors who hesitated in their duties were executed without hesitation. Generals who questioned his decisions faced exile or death. Even his oldest companions, men who had marched with him from Macedon, found themselves under his watchful, unforgiving gaze. The trust that had once bound king and comrades together had begun to unravel. Where once Alexander's charisma and vision had been enough to inspire unwavering loyalty, fear now became the foundation of his empire. It was effective, but it came at a price: the growing isolation of a ruler who could no longer distinguish between devotion and deceit. Yet the story of Bessus did not fade. Long after his death, travelers crossing the desolate plains of Bactria spoke of the stake that had once held his body, a lonely monument consumed by wind and sand.
Merchants repeated the tale to their apprentices, soldiers to their sons, and poets wove it into verses that lamented both the traitor's fall and the conqueror's fury. The image of Bessus's lifeless body, left for the sun, the birds, and the desert, became part of the region's folklore, a tale whispered as both warning and lament. Historians who later chronicled Alexander's campaigns saw in Bessus's fate an enduring lesson about ambition without wisdom. The satrap had possessed power, wealth, and authority, but he had lacked understanding. He had misjudged the temperament of the man who pursued him and the nature of power itself. In betraying one king to appease another, he had sealed his own destruction. Even more than 2 millennia later, Bessus's name still appears in the annals of antiquity, not as a conqueror, nor as a hero, but as a symbol of the peril that comes from overreaching ambition. His was the fate of those who imagine they can play the game of kings without grasping the cost of failure. For Alexander, the episode became another layer of the legend that surrounded him, a tale of both glory and ruthlessness. Modern readers often remember his genius, his lightning campaigns, his revolutionary strategies, his dream of a world united under a single rule. Yet the execution of Bessus stands as a reminder of the darker truths that accompanied that greatness, the cruelty that sustained it, the need to dominate not only armies but hearts, and the terrifying resolve of a man determined to erase betrayal from his shadow. It is tempting, from the distance of centuries, to see the outcome as inevitable, the ambitious satrap destroyed by the unstoppable conqueror. But in its time, it was far from certain. It was a deadly game of pursuit and survival, of betrayal and retribution, fought across the endless expanse of empire. The hunted and the hunter, the betrayer and the avenger, locked in a struggle that ended not with battle but with spectacle. And when the hill where Bessus died finally grew silent, when the stake was pulled from the earth and his remains were cast away, the memory did not die with him. It lived on in whispers and in fear, in the stories told by soldiers returning home, by merchants crossing deserts, and by poets seeking to understand the nature of power. Long after their empires had turned to dust, the tale remained, the echo of two men whose destinies were bound together by ambition, betrayal, and vengeance. In the end, the tale of Bessus is not merely a story of ancient politics or the clash of empires. It is a haunting reflection on the razor-thin line that separates power from ruin, on the moment when ambition transforms into overreach, and on the relentless pursuit of vengeance by a man who would not forgive betrayal, no matter how far he had to go, or how many lives he had to break to punish it. It speaks to the nature of power itself, alluring yet perilous, capable of elevating a man to divine status, or dragging him down to a fate worse than death. And so his story endures, whispered across centuries as a grim warning. Bessus, the satrap who reached for the throne, and found instead the stake, the man whose end stood as one of the most merciless acts of royal justice in the ancient world. His execution became a dark testament to an age when kings ruled through fear as much as through valor, when order was built upon terror, and when the price of treason was measured not only in blood, but in screams that echoed across barren plains and windswept deserts. Bactria, 329 BC. The city lies heavy under the noonday sun, its streets shimmering with heat and dust. A crowd has gathered, murmuring with a mix of awe and dread, as soldiers drag a broken man through the dirt. His body is battered and bruised, his once proud face swollen beyond recognition, crusted with blood and grime. His wrists are lashed cruelly behind his back with rawhide cords that have bitten deep into the flesh after days of captivity and torture. He stumbles, half-conscious, as jeers rise from the crowd. This man is Bessus, once the powerful satrap of Bactria, master of vast territories stretching across the eastern reaches of the Persian Empire. He had ruled over cities, commanded thousands of soldiers, and wielded the kind of influence that made him second only to the great king himself.
In his halls once glittered gold silks and the symbols of Persian nobility. Yet the same ambition that had elevated him now marked him for ruin. Believing himself destined for greater glory, he had dared to declare himself the heir of Darius III, after betraying and murdering him in cold blood, a crime that would seal his fate for eternity. Now, under the unyielding command of Alexander the Great, Bessus faces a punishment reserved for the most despised of traitors, Impalement, one of the most horrifying deaths the ancient world had ever devised. It was a method designed, not just to kill, but to destroy utterly, to strip away dignity, identity, and hope. The condemned could linger for hours, even days, skewered upon a wooden stake, their suffering prolonged by precision and cruelty. Every gasp, every cry, every heartbeat of agony served as a spectacle for the living, a grim warning written upon the flesh of the condemned. The crowd that pressed in around him understood this well. Farmers, soldiers, merchants and slaves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the glaring sun, their faces taut with anticipation. Some watched out of hatred, others out of morbid curiosity, but all knew they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the dust had settled. The conqueror's justice would be swift and absolute. But how did it come to this? How did a man who once commanded the loyalty of provinces, who dined among nobles and led armies in the name of the Persian crown, descend to this brutal and humiliating end? His was not a fall of sudden misfortune, but a long, slow collapse shaped by greed, fear, and misplaced confidence. To understand his fate, we must turn back the clock to 336 BC, the year when Alexander of Macedon, not yet 20 years old, ascended to the throne. The young king, restless and brilliant, had already secured his dominance over Greece through both diplomacy and force. Yet his ambition stretched far beyond the Aegean. His gaze was fixed eastward, upon the vast and glittering Persian Empire, the greatest dominion the world had ever known. With an army of some 35,000 men, disciplined and fiercely loyal, Alexander began the campaign that would define his place in history. He marched eastward, his banners fluttering beneath the blazing sun, driven by an unshakable vision to conquer the empire that had once humbled Greece and to unite the known world under his rule. His advance was as methodical as it was relentless, a storm of iron and will that swept through Asia Minor, toppling satrapies and crushing any who dared resist. At that same time, Bessus, whose full name was Artaxerxes Bessus, stood among the most powerful men in Persia. As Satrap of Bactria, he governed a region of immense importance, a vast expanse stretching across what is now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. His domain was both a frontier and a fortress, a stronghold of Persian power nestled among rugged mountains and fertile river valleys. From his capital, he ruled over countless subjects, collected tributes, and commanded armies hardened by years of frontier warfare. Bessus's wealth and authority were matched only by his pride. Chroniclers of the time described him as a tall, imposing figure, broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard, and eyes that shone with intelligence and quiet ambition. He dressed in the fine robes of Persian nobility and carried himself with the poise of one born to command. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was a hunger, a desire not just to serve kings but to become one. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia and began his legendary campaign, Bessus was already in his 40s, a seasoned general and a trusted ally of Darius III. He fought with distinction at the great Battle of Gaugamela near Arbela, where the Persians faced Alexander's army in one of antiquity's most decisive clashes. But despite their courage, the Persian forces were shattered by Alexander's tactics and the unbreakable discipline of the Macedonian phalanx. In the aftermath of that defeat, Darius's authority began to crumble. The great king abandoned his palaces and treasures, retreating eastward with what remained of his loyal guard.
Each loss diminished him in the eyes of his nobles, and as his power waned, the seeds of betrayal began to take root. For men like Bessus, the sight of a king in flight was intolerable, a sign that the gods had withdrawn their favor. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and disillusionment that Bessus made his fateful choice. What had begun as loyalty turned to calculation, and calculation turned to treachery. He saw in Darius's weakness not tragedy but opportunity, a chance to seize power for himself, to reshape Persia under his own rule. And so, while Alexander pressed forward from the west, the first cracks of betrayal began to spread through the Persian ranks, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead Bessus not to a throne, but to the stake.